I am so excited for foundation paper piecing. When you had mentioned this, I was just super pumped to show it.
It's a really fun technique, and you can get a lot of really cool results from it, but it can be a little intimidating if you don't know how to start.
Well, and you are a fabulous teacher, so I'm very excited to watch your segment. Before we begin, do you want to go ahead and tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So hello, everyone who doesn't know me. I'm Chris Marchini. I am online as Rose City Originals. I do a lot of tutorials for teaching how to quilt. I take you along on my quilting journey. Pretty interesting projects every now and then.
And he's a very talented shirt creator.
Very talented shirt creator, quilter.
I'm wearing my Christmas shirt today for our Christmas in July.
Love it. Hey, by the way, have you finished that tutorial on your shirt?
Yes, it is live on my YouTube. There's actually two tutorials. One is making the shirt from start to finish, and one is how to pattern match down the front and on the pocket.
I will let you take it away, Chris, and we'll see some foundation paper piecing.
Sounds good. Thank you. All right, so for today, we are starting off very basic so you can get the fundamentals of paper piecing. I will be making a block from start to finish, and if we have a moment at the end, I'm going to show you an example of a more complicated thing that you can do with the technique. But for today, we are making a traditional pineapple block. I will be making the 6-inch version, but this is available 6-inch and then also the 12-inch, which was the example I just showed. And these pads that you can get from Sewing Parts Online are really handy. On the inside cover, it gives you all of the dimensions to rough cut your pieces to. And then it's just a pad of paper. It's all pre-printed, so you don't have to worry about printing it out at home. Like the entire pattern is just that. It is 42 sheets per pad, and right here it tells you how many blocks you need to create different sizes of quilts. So if you want to go from a wall hanging all the way up to a king quilt, it will tell you how many pineapple blocks you'll need to finish it. So very handy there. So I have ripped off one of these. On one side, you have all of your markings. It's all printed for you. The other side is just blank. The side that is blank is where your fabric is going to end up, and you're going to use the lines on the printed side to actually sew. So if you're new to sewing and you're still practicing your 1/4-inch seam or even just sewing a straight line, this is a really great way to practice. For this block, we're going to start by attaching a square in the center. You'll notice that there are numbers. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it goes all the way up. There are 25 pieces total. And you just follow that. You start with piece 1, then 2, then 3, and so on. One thing that might be handy when you are starting out is to get something like a light box, but you can also just use a bright window if you don't have one. And this is just so you can flip it over and still see those lines. These are generally printed on lighter weight paper, so you can see through it. Probably can't on camera, but I can see through it. But if you can't, a light box or a bright window definitely helps. So like I said, we're going to start with piece 1. So that is our square right here. And then just a fabric glue stick is going to be your best friend when you are starting paper piecing. It doesn't take a lot, but this really helps keep that piece in place because there's nothing else holding it to the paper. So you want to just glue that in. The pattern tells you what size to cut this, but generally it's about a 1/4 inch larger so that you have that seam allowance beyond each of your lines. We've got that attached. And now what we'll do is the line between 1 and 2 is where we're going to be sewing. So you can take any straight edge. This is an add a 1/4 ruler, also very handy when doing paper piecing. It has, I'll just show you real quick, if you can see that in the camera. It has a little lip right here. And that'll come in handy when we start folding the paper over. And the lip is 1/4 inch from the edge where you'll cut. But right now we're just gonna fold along this line. It doesn't have to be perfect. We're just gonna fold that back, and that is where we're going to sew. So this was already trimmed at a 1/4 inch, so we're good there. But what I'm going to do now is take my first colored fabric, line up those edges, and then we're going to stitch through the paper and the fabric just from this point to this point. So we're going to, like I said, sew through all the layers, the paper and both layers of fabric. Let's see. All right. When you're paper piecing, you are going to want to lower your stitch length to anywhere from like a 1.5 to a 1.8. That's going to help you later on tear all the paper out. The more perforations there are, it'll just make it easier. But you don't want there to be so much that your paper is falling apart before you finish your block. Another couple pointers are at the beginning and end of your seam, you're going to want to do like a little back stitch, not a lot. But because you'll be eventually pulling these papers out, you don't want to accidentally pull your seam out with it. So a couple back stitches will really be helpful. And this is also a time when your automatic thread cutter comes in really handy. So having the TL series that they were just showing is really handy to have. Otherwise, you'd have to end it, pull this out, and trim a whole lot of threads. I've done it before. It's not fun. Sew this seam. Take a couple stitches and back stitch. And then just follow the line. Now we're going to take this and press it open. I do like to finger press just to make sure it covers everything. I just have my ironing station set up right next to me. I also have my cutting mat set up. I have my cutting mat set up here as well. Actually, Brian, go ahead and switch to the overhead. It'll be easier to see it that way. So now we have that piece on. Piece 3 is next. So we're going to fold back, follow the same process. And I think on 4 and 5, we'll be able to do some trimming, so I can show that. So we just line that up. A great thing about this is your 1/4 inch seam does not have to be perfect. Because you are stitching on this line, you're not relying on the edge of the fabric to judge your 1/4 inch seam. Okay, so we'll do the same thing. Take a couple stitches and back stitch. And you only want to go to the edge of that line. You really don't want to go beyond it. If you do go a stitch beyond, it's not the end of the world, but it will mean that you're tearing your paper a little when you fold the next line. So we've got piece 1, 2, and 3. Now we're going to fold back piece 4. You'll notice, my fabric shifted. You'll notice we have these pieces overhanging. So we're going to need to trim those off because you could leave them. It's not going to change the front of the block. But if you leave it there, by the time you're done, you're going to have a whole bunch of bulk everywhere. And now my first fabric shifted, so it is not going to catch. So we need to do a little bit of surgery here. Press these real quick. So what I'm going to do, luckily this happened early on. This is usually the point that it would happen. So I'm going to very carefully peel these off. It's going to rip the paper. Oops. And I'm just going to adjust everything and then glue it down really well. Put a little more glue this time. This is where the seam is going to be. I need to go a 1/4 inch further and then make sure those line up. Maybe setting the glue will help a little. There we go. That is much better. So let's fold back on number 4 again because I need to retrim that. There we go. Not the end of the world. And now we're going to take our next piece. I'm keeping this first ring all the same color. So we are just going to line that up and center it. And then stitch along that line. Perfect. So my piece moved, but I can just take a couple stitches out and retry. Fold that back. Make sure all of our pieces are lined up. I'm just going to sew that seam again. You get to see the less glamorous side of quilting.
We've had so many people say that they love seeing the troubleshooting portion of it. So no worries at all, Chris.
Oh, good. I was actually doing a live last night, just cutting out a shirt, and it was a very difficult pattern matching. And so I made a comment about that. Like, this is the stuff you don't see in my videos. I normally edit it out. So for here, I'm just going to finger press this one side back. And because this is far enough away, while I'm at the sewing machine, I'll just go ahead and sew the next seam. So I sewed that seam before trimming it, so I can just trim it after the fact. and then press it back. You'll notice the little edges here are flaps, and that's fine because those are going to get trimmed off. So we have our first round that is in the colored fabric. Now we're going to do our second round all in the background fabric. So I just finished piece 5. We'll move on to piece 6. And while we're here, I'm also going to fold back and trim piece 7. That way I can sew in pairs and just be a little bit more efficient with my back and forth from the machine to pressing and trimming. One thing that I know a lot of beginner paper piecers get tripped up with is the very beginning block. That's the only block that you're going to put having face up. The rest of your pieces, as you put them together, you want them right sides together, so they're going to be face down towards the paper. And that can get a little confusing. So one thing I do recommend on your very first piece, use something like a solid fabric or even a batik, and that will really help because there is no right and wrong side, so you don't have to worry about that. You can really just focus on getting the technique down. Now to keep these ones from shifting on me like the last couple have, I'm just going to throw some pins in and just pin it to the fabric underneath. You can pin through the paper. Oh, I think I actually caught it on that one, but it doesn't always want to catch. So if you at least pin it to the fabric, you should be fine.
Julianne has a question. She is asking, how do you make sure you are using the color you intend on each numbered piece?
So on here, it looks like the odd, well, not even all the odd numbers, but the background is white, and then the places where they intend you to put color, according to the pattern, they have it kind of shaded gray. Now, in a pattern that has that's more complex, where they have specific colors, they will usually put some kind of indicator, like either a symbol or a letter, to tell you which color goes where. Because these are typically printed in black and white. They're not going to print them in color to show you what goes where. But that's the indicator for this one, is just the gray is where the colors are going to go. Back over to the machine, hoping we can finish this full block, because I have a really fun one to show you of a more advanced block. This one, my pin's in the way, so we'll get that out of there. All right, back to the overhead. So those are in. I'm going to press them back. Okay, so that was 6 and 7. We move on to 8 and 9. And when you're folding these back, like, try to get on the line, but if you're a little off, it's okay. This is just for the trimming. When you do your stitching, you will be directly on the line. So your trimming is not going to affect your seam allowance when you are doing the foundation paper piecing, which is another benefit with either if you're a new sewist or if you're doing a really complex pattern. All right.
Chris, Rebecca is asking, what machine are you using? Yay!
I am using the Juki TL2010Q. So I think it was the second machine that he demoed in the last segment. And it is a wonderful machine. I bought it from Sewing Parts Online and highly recommend it when people start asking me about machines. Normally I don't pin, but things seem to be going in my favor today. So I'm going to do this just for the sake of not having to rip seams on camera. Just a couple pins to hold these in place while I travel over to the machine, and then we'll go sew those. Press those back. And then it's really nice because you basically just keep repeating for this block in particular, for the pineapple, until you end up with your entire block. Now, I wonder if might be far enough apart now. Let's see, which ones were those? 8 and 9, so next is 10, where I can do all 4 at once.
I have a question for you. It's totally random.
Okay.
How do you know Tanner Frost Bowen?
From TikTok.
You guys are TikTok buddies because you're both in Portland, right?
Yeah, he moved to Portland, I think last year at some point. I have not met him in person yet, but we need to, because I think he's not that far from me, because I know he goes to the thrift shop that is not far from me. He
Gotcha. We've been trying to get him to do SewCreative Live, and he seems interested. I'm trying to convince him. So I was hoping if you knew him personally, you could convince him for me.
I will see what I can do.
Thanks, Chris.
13. Oh, I skipped 12. All right, so I'm going to fold back all 4. I'm going to see if I can do them all at once. Because none of the seams overlap, I should be able to get them all at one time. So I've got my first round of color, and then I have a round of background. So I'm back onto a round of color. I'm sure Brian and Trisha, you probably recognize this fabric. This is the 3rd time I've used it for SewCreative Live.
I'm so glad that it's so useful.
It was nice. So the 6-inch blocks you cut them down to 1.5 inches. So it's a really good one for little scrap strips. I'm not going to be able to do 4 at once because they would get caught in this seam. So before I stitch, I'm just going to make sure that these stay lined up.
It's so great seeing you do this because I've wanted to learn how to do it for so long, but it kind of messes with my brain. So I'm really trying to absorb what you're doing here.
Oh, good. Yes. It's a really great technique to know because you can get such great results. I mean, this is a fairly simple block that you can do many ways. I just actually made a pineapple block using the Creative Grids pineapple trim tool, which is also awesome. There's an AccuQuilt die for it. Like, there's so many ways to make a pineapple block, so it's really personal preference. But the foundation paper piecing technique really opens up so many possibilities.
Yeah, I love the variety on that. We do have a couple of questions for you as well, Chris. Brenda's asking, what was that little ruler that you were using again?
That is the Add a Quarter ruler. So it has a little lip. And when you fold your
you can see it perfectly.
Yeah, that just catches on the fold, and then you trim right here, and that's your 1/4 inch. So you don't have to worry about lining up the markings on your ruler. So it's just a little bit faster. And when you have, hundreds of places you have to trim, every second that you can shave off of your process really adds up.
Julianne is also asking, do you have to change your needles more often going through paper like that?
I have not noticed a difference. I don't change my needles as often as I should, but you still want to have a nice sharp needle because you are going through the fabric and you don't want it to catch on the threads of your fabric and pull them weird. But you should be replacing your needle between every project anyway. But I haven't really noticed a big difference. This paper is fairly thin. A lot of them also will be printed on like a newsprint paper. You can actually buy blank newsprint paper for printing if you buy them like PDF style. And that definitely doesn't affect the needle longevity that I've found anyway.
Would fabric glue work to hold pieces in place prior to sewing the lines?
I wouldn't use like a permanent fabric glue, but something like the fabric glue sticks do help. Yes. I would say it needs to be something that could easily peel away. Like if you were using it instead of pins and you wanted to just like glue it down in place, you want to be able to pull it open and then press it flat. So nothing that leaves a residue and nothing permanent.
Perfect. And Cindy is saying that she uses a Microtech 70 needle for paper piecing. So thank you for that little tip, Cindy.
Yes, thank you. I don't think I've ever used a Microtech needle, and I probably should give them a try.
Oh, I love having a Microtech needle handy. Those are such great ones. Microtech, I love having a top stitch, leather, and denim. Those are the ones that I always like to have on hand.
All right, we'll head back over to the overhead and give these a proper pressing. So in between them, I just finger pressed them open just to get them out of the way. But before I put my next pieces on, I want to make sure those seams are nice and crisp. Then we'll do that again. Let's see, we ended off at 13. So we're nearing the end here. Any other questions coming up?
We don't have any so far. Trisha is stepping away for a sec.
No worries. So we think we're actually doing really good on time. So I have actually the Kicks pattern by Latifah Saafir, which I know you can get at Sewing Parts Online. I made a test block, and it is, I would say, infinitely more complex than this one. But I think it's a great example to show what you can do with this technique. Like the pineapple block's a good beginner to get you kind of introduced to the technique. But then there's quilters out there. If anyone follows Pride and Joy Quilting on Instagram, she designs her own patterns, and she did one that was like a family portrait of her and her sons, and it's incredible. And they're just the most detailed quilts I've ever seen, and it's all foundation paper piecing. So this really opens up the possibilities with quilting. All right, now we have another round of the background. These ones don't overlap, so I can just lay them down and go stitch them. I will make sure that they stay in place before I stitch, though. All right, back over to the machine. So since you've already folded the paper, it's really easy to lift it up and just make sure that those edges are somewhat aligned. Again, they don't have to be perfect because you're not relying on them for your seam allowance. I'm just going to work in the round here rather than following the numbers. On some patterns, it's very important to follow the number order. This one, not so much. But I would say, especially on your first block, like if you haven't made the pattern before, follow the numbers and then see if it's like, oh, I can, you know, sew these two at the same time. Alrighty, got all of those attached. So back over to the overhead.
We have another quick question here for you, Chris. How do you figure out how a piece of fabric will cover when there's an angle?
That is a great question, because that is something that other sample block I started definitely was more of a challenge. This one, they tell you what size to cut everything, so it's going to cover. But if you have a weird angle, that's another place where the light box will come in handy. Here, let me trim one of these first, and then I'll show you what you can do.
I just want to interject really quickly with the light box aspect. Yesterday we had shown the Sew Steady Wish 2.0 table, and Stacy's going to be coming on to show the acrylic table for the basic ones too. But you can turn your acrylic table into a light box with their light box stick too. So just something to keep in mind. I see that little handy dandy thing is awesome too, but we've got other options as well.
That would be amazing, because then I wouldn't have this extra thing floating around my surface if it was built in.
Exactly. You would have an expandable work area, and then you could just easily turn it into a light box. So
that would
may have to get with you on that, Chris.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so that was a row of background. So I'm going to be moving on to another color. And the question was, how do you know that your piece is going to cover this? Just say this wasn't a trapezoid and it was a weird, funky shape. When you fold it back and line up your seam, you want the fabric to fully cover what your shape is. So sometimes it's hard to see. One thing you can do is on the back side of your fabric, maybe like make a mark, like this is how far out it needs to come, so that when you fold it back, because now you're trying to shine light through, you know, 3 layers of fabric and paper and all of that. So you'd be able to see, okay, I can tell my red fabric comes to right here. I kind of lose visibility, but I know it's about right there. It's not going to fully cover. So I would need to pick a different piece of fabric. For this piece, it's coming to here. So I know I'm fully covered. I have the coverage. This that I've marked is the seam line. So you also want to make sure that it goes out about 1/4 of an inch beyond that. But in the other pattern, I'll show you some areas that it was a little more tricky. It also can get tricky if you're trying to have like a directional fabric point the right direction. It can get a little confused. So that's 19. Let's trim these up, nearing the end. Anyone has any other questions, I'm happy to answer.
Sherry is saying, I like to use freezer paper so I don't have to rip at the end. Have you done that before?
I think I have. I know what technique she's talking about. So with freezer paper, you would print your pattern onto the non-shiny side of the freezer paper. And then the back side would be the shiny side. And when you iron that onto fabric, it has like a really temporary adhesion to the fabric. And what you would do is fold this back. This is all ironed onto the fabric, so it's nice and stuck in place. Line up your next piece. And then rather than sewing, like flipping this back and sewing through the paper, you would leave it folded back and stitch like ever so slightly off the paper. So your needle is grazing the paper. But that way, when you're done, you can just peel the paper off in one piece. Your block is still, it's done. It's one block. And your paper is still in a single piece, and you can use it again, usually like 6 to 10 times until it just stops sticking to the fabric.
That sounds like a cool technique.
It is. It takes a little more prep work, but it is definitely a technique. And if you are doing a lot of the same block, it can save you from having to print it out and use a lot of paper.
Nice. Also, NC Boot is saying, where did you get the light box? I'm assuming she's talking about the one that you're showing, and then I'll also explain what I talked about before.
I think this was a Christmas gift, honestly, and it probably came off of Amazon. It's not the greatest, but it gives just enough light to see through it.
Cool. And if you're talking about what I had mentioned before, we have the option for Sew Steady tables. They're going to give you an expandable work surface, and you can get one of the Sew Steady accessories, which is a light stick that you can easily convert your acrylic table into a light box. So that's what I was referring to, and I think that would be an awesome option as well.
Yeah, I need to look into that because I think that would be awesome. These are the last round of color pieces. And here you can see on the edge, there's 2 lines. This is going to be your final seam allowance when joining your seams together. And then this outer line is your trim line. And it actually says it right here, do not trim this line, trim this line. So when I am sewing my piece on, I want to make sure that it goes and covers not only the seam line, but all the way out to the edge. So I can see like right here, I have enough. And right here, I have enough. That way, it's in your final seam allowance and you don't cut yourself short. We're going to go to the next one.
Pamela's asking, do you ever use the triangles on a roll or angles? Is that what they are?
I have not. I don't think. I may have. It's a paper piecing technique to make half square triangles. So it's just a roll of paper that has the angles printed on it, and you can actually say like take a 2.5-inch strip and you almost sew like a zigzag, and then you end up with all of your half square triangles. So it's like a super speedy way to get a whole bunch of half square triangles. All right, I've got my 4 red squares on, so we'll go and press those open at the overhead camera. Perfect. And then the last ones, they're going to go right here in the corners, but we do still need to check these and probably trim them a little. It has you cut your pieces at 1.5 inches to start, but that's a little generous. which is good. But we want to make sure that our next pieces reach all the way out to the corner. So I am going to trim these. So here's where that add a quarter really comes in handy. You can see it's kind of like the block rulers, but it catches that fold. So you don't even have to think about lining up your 1/4 inch marks. And I know on a lot of my rulers, the 1/4 inch mark is at the very edge, obviously. It's 1/4 inch from in, but the numbers on the ruler tend to block out the 1/4 inch marks on a lot of brands. So this is specifically for foundation paper piecing. Next, we're going to add these to each of the corners, and then we will trim our final block, and it'll be ready. So we'll head back over to the machine. Some of these tone-on-tone prints are really hard to tell which is the print side and which is the back side. So one trick I've learned is you can actually use a black light and shine it, and you'll be able to tell which side has the printing on it and which side doesn't. The batteries in my black light are dead, though, so it's not going to help me out.
That's all right. I've got another comment here from Rebecca. She's saying, I want to do this paper piecing, but scared of it. Rebecca, you and I can learn together. Maybe we'll do it on the social circle because I really want to try it and we can just learn together. Brian, you want to try it too?
I would love to.
We'll all learn it together.
I don't know though. I think my priority is pixel quilting.
Well, we'll do some pixel quilting. We'll do some paper piecing. We've got lots to do.
This is a really good pattern for practicing and like getting into paper piecing because it's not a lot of tricky angles. It's not a lot of teeny tiny pieces. It'll really help just get the basics down of how it works.
I also like the fact that it has 42 pieces of paper. So if you mess up a bunch of times, it's totally okay.
Yep. All right, last seam. Pretty sure that's right side up. Alrighty, so we can switch back to the overhead, probably for the last time. I'm just going to press those back. Had I not done this already, I probably would have freaked out because this fabric doesn't go all the way to the edge of the paper, but it does cover the trim line, so we're good. Get all 4 of these pressed back. And because the edges aren't sewn, sometimes they can get a little out of hand, but you really only need to make sure you're pressing where the seam is. So if the edges stay a little unpressed or get weird, it's okay. All right, and now we're going to trim this up for the last time. Let's see here, you can tell where the 1/4 inch would be. It's where the numbers are. So it makes it a little tricky on some rulers to find your true 1/4 inch. And now we're just going to trim through all of the layers. And I'm sure someone's going to ask about dulling the blades. You're not doing a whole lot of cutting. So I have not found it dulls my blades, but I think it's going to depend on what kind of paper it's printed on. Like if you're using regular computer paper, it probably will. But if you're using that newsprint or a lighter weight, it shouldn't be too big a deal. And there we go. We have a finished pineapple block.
Oh, that's awesome, Chris. I love it.
So this is, like I've said probably too many times, it's a really simple block. It's a great intro to foundation paper piecing. But once you get the hang of it, you can do a much more complex block. So this is that Kicks pattern by Latifah Saafir. You'll end up with a block that has multiple pieces that you have to sew onto a single piece of paper. So this one is made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 different pieces of paper that you have to sew onto. And then you assemble them together. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So I guess I lied. I will go back to the machine one more time. You trim on all the dotted lines, and then this line is your seam line. So before you take your paper off, you're going to line everything up and then sew along that line to join it together. So a lot of the more complex patterns, you will end up with this. And it's just because of the way the angles fall. Sometimes you can't get it on to a single piece of fabric or piece of paper. All right. right, so back over to the overhead and I'll press this one. Now when pressing these seams, when I join the pieces together, I kind of let the seams do what they want, because especially here with the laces, like there is a tiny little piece of fabric right there at the end of that lace. That's a tiny piece of fabric. I mean, we're talking itty bitty, but you end up with a lot of seams and a lot of bulk. So sometimes your seam just wants to go one way or the other, and I will let it. I try to press these seams open where I can. This one I think will be fine, but like right here, I pressed these ones in because there was far less bulk on this centerpiece than the two outer pieces. And that's just the way the seams wanted to go. Foundation paper piecing will get bulky. So it's just one of the trade-offs to getting a really cool block. Yes.
We have another question from Linda. She's asking, what's the difference between English paper piecing and foundation paper piecing?
That is a great question. Someone asked me that yesterday when I posted I'd be teaching this class. So foundation paper piecing is what we've been doing today. You have your foundation paper and you are sewing to it. English paper piecing is used most commonly in like a hexagon quilt. And that is where you would take your piece of paper, typically like a heavier cardstock, and you cut your fabric a 1/4 inch larger and you fold over the edges and either glue baste it down or thread baste it down. And then each of those blocks you then sew together by hand. And that's because you have like Y seams or just weird sharp angles that you wouldn't normally be able to do on your sewing machine. So English paper piecing is a hand piecing technique and foundation paper piecing is for machine. But that is definitely a good thing to know when shopping for patterns.
Definitely. But I was just going to say with English paper piecing, it seems like that's kind of a craze right now. We have quite a few of our sewing friends that have been taking it up. It seems very relaxing. Like you can just kind of bring it with you. It's kind of like crocheting or knitting.
Yes, it is a good on the go project.
Yeah.
I have a friend up in Canada who does like the smallest hexagons I have ever seen. And they have the patience for it. I certainly don't. But
I understand. I don't know if I would.
Right. Yeah. It definitely gives a different look to your overall finished quilt though. Yeah, so this is again, it's the Kicks pattern by Latifah Saafir, and it is available at Sewing Parts Online. This is, I forget what she calls it because she couldn't call it the actual name of the shoe. I think it's Charles instead of Chuck. So there's obviously a Converse sneaker, there's a Puma sneaker, and I think a Nike or Adidas. So there's 3 different shoes in the pattern, and it makes a really cool quilt.
Very cool. Brian and I were just chatting. When you put your quilt together, does the foundation paper piecing like affect your actual quilting? Is it harder or do you find it's the same? What do you usually do for a design?
Oh, like the final quilting?
Yeah.
I have not, I think, quilted one myself yet of one that was fully paper piece, but there's definitely bulk. And when you're done sewing everything together, these papers do need to come out. So that's going to reduce some of the bulk. Pull some of these center ones out. Tweezers are going to be your friend for this part, but you will just rip the papers out and expose the fabric. That way you don't have a crinkly quilt, but there's still going to be a lot of bulk in some areas. So when I do finally quilt this quilt, I'm going to have to be really cautious with my automation that it doesn't get caught on any of these big bulky seams. So I will probably do a less dense pattern so that it can more easily glide across. But for like the pineapple one, it's not bulky at all. It's pretty standard seams. So I actually made a pineapple quilt and quilted it with a pineapple pentagram. Super fun.
That's awesome. Denise is saying, "Oh, I've watched you on lots of TikToks."
Yeah, I try to post often. My kids are visiting right now, so I skipped a couple days, but yeah, I'm usually really active on TikTok, Instagram, posting lots of fun videos. I just finished up my crumb-pieced double wedding ring, which I did do foundation paper style of the crumb piecing, which saved a lot of measuring and counting.
Is that the one that you did in black and white and didn't expose the color of your quilt till the end?
Yeah, so the last several videos were all in black and white because I was keeping the background color a secret. But I still wanted to post
really
video.
fun.
So how do I can't just not show the majority of the quilt.
I love how you do fun things like that. That's awesome on your TikTok. I think that about wraps it up. Again, do you want to just tell everybody where they can find you, Chris?
Sure. So I am online as Rose City Originals. So Rose like the flower. I'm in Portland, Oregon. So we are the city of roses. That's where the name came from. I'm on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and now on Threads. Not sure what I'm doing there, but I'm there. So
Seen that the other day and I'm like, what in the world is Threads?
it's just a new
So-
social media app.
Yeah, brand new. Well, the other thing too is, as we were mentioning before about your shirt, I will definitely share that on our Facebook group because it's awesome. I do love your Christmas shirt. That's a lot of fun. Well, thank you once again, Chris. I mean, you answered all the questions that we had throughout, and everybody was just saying, I love Chris. He's such a great teacher. So we just appreciate you taking your time and teaching us this foundation paper piecing. So
Absolutely. Glad to be back.
hopefully we can do it again. All right. Thanks, Chris. You have a great day.